Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Welcome to the webinar, Engaging Students in the Success of School Breakfast. My name is Emily, and I'll be managing the back end, the technical side of the webinar. So if you're having any technical difficulties with audio or with the screen, you can go ahead and chat me either via the chat function on your menu or in the question section. We will be doing a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar, so please chat your questions in on the question box throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them later. If we don't get to your question today, we can follow up afterwards. And we will also be sending the slides and a webinar recording after the webinar via email. So anyone who's attending or has registered will receive a copy of the webinar afterwards. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kelly.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Kelly, and I'm a program manager with the No Kid Hungry Center for Best Practices. In this role, I develop resources and provide technical assistance and training around the school breakfast program. I'm also excited today to have 3 guest speakers with us that are going to be sharing their own firsthand experiences with engaging students more broadly, and then also thinking specifically about engaging students within the school breakfast program. So I'm excited today to have my colleague here at No Kid Hungry, Ria, join us. I'm also excited to have Dr. Rob Jackson from Edenton-Chowan Schools in North Carolina, and Amy Shanafelt from the University of Minnesota to speak about some breakfast work there. As for our agenda today, I'm going to start by sharing a very brief overview of No Kid Hungry, and then I will turn it over to our first guest speaker, my colleague Ria, to highlight some foundational information about youth engagement. Next, you'll hear from me again, highlighting a variety of ideas for engaging students in the success of school breakfast. And then we'll hear from our special guests today, Dr. Rob Jackson and Amy Shanafelt, who will speak about their firsthand experiences engaging students in the school breakfast program. As Emily mentioned, we'll conclude our webinar today with audience questions, and we hope that you will submit those questions throughout the webinar as they pop up, and then of course at the end when we get to that portion. So let's talk briefly about No Kid Hungry. For those of you that may not be as familiar with the campaign, No Kid Hungry is a campaign by Share Our Strength. Share Our Strength is a national anti-hunger organization. Our headquarters is based in Washington, D.C., but our work touches all 50 states in some way. And what we know is that nutrition programs like school breakfast already exist to feed kids. The problem is that these programs are often underutilized. There are common barriers that are preventing these programs from reaching the kids in need. So we're working to increase access and ensure more kids get the nutritious meals they need to learn, grow, and thrive. And with that, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Ria, who's going to cover some of the basic principles of youth engagement.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. I work on our youth engagement team here at Share Our Strength, specifically on Generation No Kid Hungry, which is our platform engaging young people. And so I'm excited to kind of talk about some youth engagement basics. I want to preface this by saying there is no perfect way to engage youth, or at least we haven't found it yet. So these are really some ideas to get you started, really hit the ground running, providing you some information, some tools that you can keep in your arsenal to get started or improve on what you're already doing. So I wanted to touch on the youth engagement ladder for this first half of the basics portion, just because I think this is a really great resource of knowing what are some examples of how people are engaging with youth, or how do you talk about the levels of engagement. This is not something that we created. It's actually from an article called Children's Participation, which is linked as a resource towards the end. But there, I've broken this up into a low tier, a mid tier, and a high tier. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. This low tier of engagement talks about 1, manipulation. Adults using young people to support their own projects and pretend that they are the result of young people's inspiration. So obviously the youth are not having any kind of an active role and are really actually being manipulated by adults, which is not something that we encourage by any means. 2, decoration. Young people help implement adults' initiatives, but they're really not there to play a role. 3, tokenism, where young people are a token. They provide participation for show. They don't have any influence on the activities that they're participating in. So these are things that we don't recommend. Mid-tier is really kind of that next level up of how do we start to engage young people in projects and work. And one option is for youth informed. So young people are assigned tasks and informed how and why they are involved in a project. So they're not making active decisions, but they are informed and willing to participate. 5, youth consulted. So adults are making the decisions and young people are consulted and informed. A great example of this, I know a lot of schools are doing this, but menu tasting with students. Adults have the purchasing power. They are the ones who are making those decisions of what is going on the menu, but they are getting that advice and input from students, which is a great way and a good step towards continuing to engage young people around these programs. And then higher tier. So this is where it gets a little hard. It's a journey. It's not a one and done kind of a situation. So you really do have to build up. And I'm learning in our work that we're constantly improving on how we're engaging students. And we learn with every single engagement. And so youth and adult equality talks about an adult initiative, but decisions are being made jointly. So an adult is coming to the table, but they are bringing the youth there and asking them to use their voice and being active in that conversation. Youth-driven, which is a lot of what we do through Generation No Kid Hungry, it's the young people's initiative and their leadership that really carries the project. I look at myself as a support mechanism for young people and how can we take their projects and get it to the next level that they want. They are really in the lead and we're just there for support. So it's youth-driven. And then lastly, youth and adult equity. Young people's initiative decisions are made in partnership with adults. So obviously young people are really empowered this generation. It's really exciting to see how excited and engaged they are in things that they're passionate about. But a lot of the time decision makers are people who are able to help make impact are adults. And so this is an important partnership of adults really using their platform, sharing it with youth, and being able to take their ideas and help it go further and create a longer lasting impact together. So that's the youth engagement ladder. I'm going to kind of kick it back over to the building blocks of youth engagement. A few years ago, us at Share Our Strength, we created a youth engagement toolkit with the help of Sodexo Stop Hunger Foundation, where we actually surveyed young people and we asked them for their input into how they want nonprofit organizations to engage with them. That being said, this is geared towards a lot of nonprofits who just don't quite know where to engage with youth at the beginning. But knowing that a lot of you on this call have access to students being a part of a district or on a campus or things like that, there's some things that make a little bit more sense than others. So I'm just going to go through them. I think this applies to everyone, asking them. Ask youth if they want to participate, telling them why we need their input, why we need them at the table, making specific requests and making sure that we are recognizing their value, the fact that they have really incredible insights that we need and want to hear. Being genuinely inclusive, learning is centered, wow, words are difficult. So making sure that everything is learning centered and that you're incorporating the needs, assets, and perspectives of youth, making it a strategic priority to make sure they're at the table. Making sure that they're getting something out of that experience, right? They're learning new skills. They're able to apply this to something else that they're doing, things along those lines. This one obviously makes sense, working with schools as a means to engage youth in the issue. This is something that we really try to focus on as a nonprofit organization, but if you are on or a part of a district or a campus, you have readily accessible youth that you can actually work with a lot easier than it is for us to go knocking on a school's doors, which I don't think anyone approves of, and just saying, hey, let us talk to your kids. And so making sure to appreciate youth and their perspective. They really do need to feel appreciated for their participation and the difference that they're making. Recognizing and celebrating their contributions is really critical in making them want to continue to participate, to really get that level of engagement so they feel ownership of whatever it is, the project or initiative that you're working with them on. I think that's really, even a nice thank you goes a long way, but I think that making sure that we're recognizing how important they are to the table is really critical, and I know that they'll remember it for a really long time. And then lastly, being responsive and authentic. So if a student has a question and they're asking you why, or if they want to know more, really making sure to speak to them on their level, communicating with them in a way that really is authentic to them. I think this is something we run into often of, what is the best way to communicate with youth? Being at a school, sometimes they don't want to follow their school on social media. So how do we connect with them in a way that they are wanting that application and things like that? And so making sure that you're responding to them, working with them on their level, and really making sure to support their efforts. So if they do bring an idea out of left field, instead of dismissing that idea, being able to say, hey, let's put it in the parking lot, or let's talk about this more, let's unpack this together. What about this idea excites you, and how do you take that and bring parts of it into your work? And then using the right communication platforms. I guess I rolled all of those into one. But understanding, how do they want to be communicated with? Is it, obviously technology is a really important thing, but earlier, like I said, some youth don't want to follow their school on social media. Maybe that's not the cool thing, or maybe it's asking youth, hey, I know that you don't want to follow me on social media. How can we get you, or what can we do differently to make this a space where you do want to stay engaged with us on social or through that communication? Do they prefer email if they are participating in a project? Do they prefer calls, right? Or do they prefer being in person and having in-person meetings? Trying to gauge, what's the best way to communicate with them? How are they going to continue to be engaged? And being receptive to what they want as well. If they're saying that something doesn't work, adapt to meet those needs. So it's a constant process. It's a journey. We're always learning. And like I said, no one has a perfect way to engage youth. I don't even think youth have a perfect way to engage each other. So we're always here for support, but going to kick it back over to Kelly. Oh, just kidding. I'm going to kick it back over to me. Yeah, being flexible. Yeah, that's something I wanted to use this quote because I think it really does embody what the youth engagement work is like. Varied strategies, constant process of learning, constantly being flexible, being willing to adapt, and knowing that, hey, it's not my thing, right? It's not my initiative that I am trying to see through. It's something that I want to build that equity. I want to work with young people and make sure that it's their initiative or their process that they're taking ownership of. So yeah. And then some fun resources. So up top, we've got the Youth Engagement Toolkit that was done by Share Our Strengths. We've also created some really great resources for educators to talk about childhood hunger in the classroom and kind of explain the issue. So we've got that linked as well. We created a service learning toolkit geared towards older kids, so teens, high schoolers specifically, who are looking to get engaged in the issue, specifically around community service. And then lastly, the article I mentioned about children's participation, where the Youth Engagement Ladder came from.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ria. We thought it was important today to start this webinar with this kind of, Youth Engagement 101, the building blocks of youth engagement, to really think about some of the key do's and don'ts as you think about working closely with the students that are in your school or the students that are in your district. And now we're going to narrow our focus a bit to start talking more specifically about ideas for engaging students in the Success of School Breakfast. This webinar is intended to provide some of the ideas of how you can be engaging your students to kind of get those creative juices flowing. We know that by no means we will cover all of the different ideas, but we're hoping that this will kind of just light a spark in thinking about ways that you can be engaging your students. So what we know is that students can be involved in various aspects of the school breakfast program. And we know that involving students is key to the success of the program. No one knows students better than students themselves. So if you ever have questions or doubts and you're really wondering, what would connect with my students? What would my students like? Ask them. They're going to have, that best information for you. So my starting recommendation is go right to the source. Go to your students. They're the customers of your school breakfast program. And beyond thinking about how they can provide input, in a moment we're going to start chatting about ways that they can be helpful in marketing, menu planning, and the delivery of school breakfast. So to talk a bit more about getting started, one of the things to think about is starting with informing students about who to talk to if they have a question, suggestion, or comment. You want to take the guesswork out of it for students too. Perhaps they do have things that they're interested in sharing, but they're just not sure who to go to. So a great place to start is just making sure that students know who that person is that they can come to if they have a question, a suggestion, or a comment about your school breakfast program. Kind of taking it then to the next level, you will want to think about providing mechanisms for student feedback. Could that be a comment box, a survey, focus groups, using social media? I think here is where you can also be thinking about ways that you can adapt these strategies for a variety of grade levels. When we think about our younger students in elementary school, perhaps a survey or a focus group, perhaps that's not the best mechanism for engaging them and getting their feedback, but there's other ways to do that. You can do surveys that, have thumbs up, thumbs down responses. The photo that I included here today is sticky dot voting. You can use photos of things and empower students with sticky dots, to provide their feedback. Something else to be conscious of is educating students about the school breakfast program so that they understand what is possible and what is not. This is something that will really help kind of manage the expectations of students so that they understand that the feedback they're providing, at times why that feedback might, turn into action and sometimes why it might not. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when it comes to involving students in taste testing, but just how we can explain to students why some parts of the program are the way that they are, so that they can then be providing effective feedback within the realities of the school breakfast program. As Ria started to touch upon in the foundational elements of youth engagement, make it a point to respond to student feedback. Students want to feel that someone is listening, so it's really important to reply to student feedback individually. Be sure to thank students for their suggestions or ideas and validate their feedback. It's also important when you're thinking about soliciting student feedback to think about the students that you're getting that feedback from. You want to be thinking both about the students that are currently participating in your program, as well as the students that are maybe not currently participating, but that you wish would come and participate in the program. It's also important to think about how you can engage students that aren't typically those students that are already very engaged. So what kind of things can you do to start reaching out to students that maybe aren't always the ones that are quickest to volunteer, and how can you connect with them and how can you get them more involved? So we're going to take a moment to talk a bit about engaging students in the marketing and promotion of the school breakfast program. There's a lot of great opportunity to engage students in the creation of marketing and promotional materials. And even within that, there are so many sub-options. This could be the creation of flyers, postcards, banners, menus. I've seen some examples where students have been engaged to design the wraps that go around grab-and-go carts. There's opportunity here for you to partner with either classes in the school or clubs. Perhaps your school has an art club or a graphic design class. Perhaps you can partner with those teachers or those staff leads and have this be an actual, project or class assignment. You can also do something, again, in thinking about how do you engage more of the students. You can host a school-wide contest. Let students know, what you're trying to do, but really give them that power and empower them to be creative. Again, going back to that idea of no one knows students better than students. So if you're trying to think, what would they like to see, as posters on the walls, what would they think would be cool wrapped around their breakfast cart? Let them take that on. They're so creative. They have so many wonderful ideas. And it'll also really just build that excitement. And it's a great way also to kind of acknowledge and celebrate a student for their work and having it be showcased in the school in that regard. There's also ways, if you have the opportunity to go kind of on a bigger scale, where you can extend this idea more broadly to cafeteria decor and design. If you find yourself with an opportunity to, make some changes to your cafeteria space, that's another great opportunity to engage your students. How can your cafeteria space be made a place that they actually want to spend time in? So just thinking about all of the ways that student input is really valuable here. And then also, as we've touched upon a little bit, is thinking about how you can get student feedback on the items that are offered as part of the school breakfast program. For example, taste tests are a very effective tool for involving students in menu planning and generating interest in the school breakfast program. You can host taste tests to get student feedback on menu items. And this is where, again, it's, I've gotten a question in the past of, well, how do you ask students what they want, on the menu and not end up with all answers that you can't give them? And this is a great way to make sure that you're striking that balance between providing them with options that for sure you can provide and letting them cast their votes. So for example, that would be like hosting a taste test where you provide 2 or 3 breakfast items that fit within the USDA nutritional guidelines, that you're able to procure for your program. So that you have all of your boxes checked on your end, and you're able to say to your students, I'd really love your feedback on which item we should add to the breakfast menu here at our school. We're going to vote on these. Now's your chance to try them. And the winning item is what will appear in the menu. And that's a great way to show that continuation of getting student feedback, engaging students in the process, and then actually being able to deliver on that feedback. And there's a resource linked here on this slide as well. There are some additional tips for hosting successful taste tests that come to us from Action for Healthy Kids. So there's just different ways to think about that as well. And then lastly, as we continue to think about some other ideas, there are ways to engage students in the packaging and delivery of breakfast. Some of this depends on the way that breakfast is being offered in your school. So for example, if your school or your district is offering breakfast in the classroom, students can have an active role transporting breakfast from the cafeteria to the classroom using rolling bags or pushing carts. I know of a high school where the Nutrition Services Department has partnered with a special ed class to engage students in the packaging of breakfast as part of a job skills development opportunity. And they also have come up with an innovative way where some students are paid to help with production and receive certification to do so. And I know of another district where the school nutrition department makes a donation to student organizations when students volunteer to assist with the program. So we share these ideas, again, just to kind of get you thinking about what is perhaps in the realm of possibility. As always, if you're interested in knowing more about what's happening in schools, in other states, in other parts of the country, we here at No Kid Hungry are happy to make those connections and be a resource for you all. And with that, I also encourage you, if you are already engaging students in the Success of School Breakfast, we would love to know about it. Or perhaps you know of another school or a district or a partner organization. We welcome you to either share it in the chat box on this webinar, or you can go ahead and email it to me and we can connect for some follow-up. But we love hearing about the great ideas that are already happening, and we love elevating and celebrating the great things that you have put into action, which is actually a wonderful segue to now highlighting some of the successful student engagement strategies that we are aware of. And we're going to start by hearing from Dr. Rob Jackson, who is the superintendent of Edmonton-Chowan District in North Carolina. So Dr. Jackson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Rob Jackson, and I appreciate being able to share our journey. And so I share from that perspective in that it is a journey that we are on. We have certainly not perfected our desire to ensure that every hungry child has something to eat, but we feel like we are on the way and appreciate the opportunity to share that. And so just as a point of jumping off, I would share with you a little about our district. We are located in Chowan County in the little small town of Edenton. We're on the northeastern corner, in the northeastern corner of the state, actually on the coast. Our school district, according to our demographics, has about 70% of our students on free and reduced lunch. We know that it's actually a higher amount of that of students who live in poverty, but we struggle with all of our families in poverty being willing to submit the paperwork because pride becomes an issue. And we see that certainly at our high school level, where our free and reduced lunch population numbers are much lower than our elementary school levels, because the issue of a student not wanting that information out among their peer groups, regardless of all of our efforts to keep it confidential, certainly shows itself, and that is probably a universal truth in high schools across the country. And so as we looked at our percentage of free and reduced lunch students and really have been working to understand the barriers and hurdles that students who grow up in poverty encounter, one of the things that we certainly came across is that children who grow up in poverty tend to become masters of hiding their hunger, particularly as they get older, as they become adolescents or teenagers. They're not as willing to say, I'm hungry, or to be seen just absolutely stuffing their mouths with as much food as possible because they're afraid that their peers may make fun of them. And so kids become very good at hiding their hunger and maybe not sharing when they're hungry. We also know that for families who are dealing with poverty and maybe in crisis, that they tend to struggle sometimes getting their children to school on time. And they, particularly teenagers who are responsible themselves for either walking to school or getting to school, they may miss a bus. And so we had a very traditional breakfast set up, in that breakfast was the first thing in the morning, and the students would arrive and go to the cafeteria, get their breakfast, sit and eat. The bell would ring and they would go to first period. And if they missed breakfast, they missed breakfast. And so we wanted to do everything we could to give them every opportunity to eat if they possibly would. I have a council called the Superintendent's Council that's made up of students. The students are selected, one, to represent all of the various cliques, to use that term, across the school. So we have students on that council who have been suspended. We have students who are the SGA president. We have students who are athletes, students in the band, students who are artists, students who aren't a member of any group or club that we can tell. And so we try to have a cross-section of our student group. So early in the process, approximately a year and a half ago, I sat down with the Superintendent's Council and I asked the question, why do you think that more of our students are not eating breakfast? And I shared with them some of the information, at least in this first bullet point, that studies have shown that good nutrition leads to improved classroom performance, higher test scores, the better behavior. They may not have cared about that, but I asked the question, why don't you think more of our students are eating breakfast? And some of their reasoning that came from them was something that wouldn't be surprising to us, but it was the very things that have led to the concept of second chance breakfast or grab and go breakfast. And that's that it wasn't very convenient. If a student's running late, they just didn't have time, or if they wanted to spend some time studying for a test or finishing homework, they didn't have time to eat the breakfast. They also shared that sometimes breakfast was messy. It was messy to sit down with a tray and pancakes and syrup and that sort of thing. It took time to do that without getting it all over themselves. And so we began to brainstorm, what could we do to ensure more children had, or more of our teenagers had, an opportunity to eat breakfast. And so they came up with a term, came up with it in the conversation, though it's not a new term to us, and that was that term of second chance breakfast. Why couldn't we have breakfast at a different time? And so we began to have that conversation and organically came to the decision that we wanted to offer a second chance breakfast. For us, it would be a breakfast break in the morning following first period, so that we would still continue to offer our traditional breakfast first thing in the morning for those students who would like to have breakfast then, but that we would have a second chance for breakfast where students could grab something, and then the menu items would be menu items that our students helped us select, and they would be of what we would use the terminology grab and go, something they could grab easily, take with them, and then take that to class, which would mean that they would be able to eat in class. And for teachers who've been around for a while, eating in class is not something that's readily embraced sometimes. And so we had to have some conversations with the adults in the building talking about why it is that we would want to allow students to eat in class and be willing to clean up afterwards if that was necessary. And so, to use a little educational jargon for a second, we have to make sure we meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we can get to Bloom's taxonomy, which is to put it in very simple terms, if a child's hungry, they're not going to do a very good job learning. And so with that common understanding, we were ready to go forward. And if we could advance the slide in moving forward with the second chance breakfast and wanting to use this grab and go concept, we went to our students in our carpentry or woodworking class and said, we need a way to offer this second chance breakfast. Our high school has multiple buildings. The main building has 2 floors, and so it is difficult in a passing period for our students to get all the way to the cafeteria and then back to class and really have any opportunity to talk to anyone or get to a locker or eat. And so we shared with our carpentry class, we need some way of packaging that, some sort of cart, and left as a class project the design of the cart. And so what you see on the screen is the first of 3 carts. 2 carts are currently under construction. This is the prototype cart. This cart was designed completely and then constructed completely by our students. And we believe that that authenticity of the buy-in piece, that it was designed by students, created by students, that for at least the next several years, we'll have students who say, you know, I helped design that cart, or I helped build that cart. And so as the cart was being designed, some of our carpentry students said, you know, we really need a cover for this cart. And they looked at ways of making the cover using plywood or other wooden materials. They talked about some things, and in the conversation, one of the young men, I happened to be in the room when they were working on this particular part of the design, said, you know, we should get somebody to sew a cover for it. And one of the other young men who was in the conversation said, well, they do a lot of sewing in that class down the hall. He was referring, of course, to the apparel class. And so the students went to the apparel class, sat down with students in the apparel class and described what they were thinking. And so the blue top you see was actually made by students in the apparel class. And once this prototype was put together, as the students were reviewing it, the students from the apparel class decided they felt like they could do better than that. And so the second and third carts will actually have blue and gold stripes on the cart, which happen to be the school colors. And so they're improving on the design, but in looking at the design on what's the left side of the screen, there's a handle there to be able to lift the cart where the legs are and roll it on the wheels. And in the right side of the screen, that kind of square area jutting out from where the wheels are, that's actually designed to hold the cooler for the cool items. And then there's 2 shelves for the grab and go items. And so having our students actually construct these carts, certainly we could have purchased carts. We're not a high wealth district, that would have been cost prohibitive perhaps, but I really think the greatest value in having these carts constructed by our students is that it helped create student buy-in. And so if we can adjust or advance the slide one more time, we began to talk about our rollout plan and went back to our superintendent's council and discussed how we might advertise this. And so we will be rolling out our Second Chance breakfast with our 3 carts, using flyers, and to the earlier part of this webinar, using flyers that were designed in our visual arts class that will go out during the summer and be a part of our social media marketing campaign. And then will be highlighted in our back to school meetings to ensure that our parents are aware of this grab and go opportunity and Second Chance breakfast, and continuing our regular breakfast as is. And so we're looking forward to hopefully, and we believe will, increase our breakfast participation. We have had some conversation with the Superintendent's Council, and they've agreed to be the quote-unquote guinea pigs and to ensure that they're participating in the grab and go breakfast, particularly in the first couple of months, so that we can get past whether or not it's a cool thing or not to grab some breakfast as you're on your way to second period. Sometimes seeing student leaders do that make it okay for other students to do that. And so we're looking forward, as we continue on this journey, to having success with increasing our breakfast participation. And we believe that taking our time and rolling out Second Chance breakfast and this grab and go concept will pay off, because we've taken the time to include our students as we've gone. And so again, we're on a journey. I do have my Twitter handle there, so there's some contact information if you'd like to share with me great ideas you have, or if we can share with you the plans that our students created for the cart, we'd be happy to do that as well. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share our journey.
Thank you so very much. I think you provided a perfect segue for me to share and admit that I actually learned about this incredibly creative student engagement project on Twitter, showing the value of social media and how things just kind of, you know, pop up that, you know, you were looking for but weren't looking for. And I appreciate so much, Dr. Jackson, you sharing this and just how you have been so committed to engaging and empowering your students. And I really look forward to learning more about your journey, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back on a future webinar to tell us, you know, how the rest of this unfolds. So Dr. Jackson will stay on with us through the end of the webinar. I see we have some questions coming in. So again, a reminder, if you have questions, please put those through the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of our webinar. But now it is my pleasure to turn the webinar over to our next special guest of the day, Amy Schoenefeld, who's going to talk to us about an example out of Minnesota.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. I am a project manager in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Minnesota, and was one of many staff members. I was the project manager and shared the role with another project manager on the breakfast study. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So the primary aim of the study was to improve or increase participation in the school breakfast program among high school students. It was a 4-year National Institutes of Health funded study led by researcher Marilyn Susie Nanny here at the University of Minnesota. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Next slide, please. So in order to kind of reach our aim, we had several strategies. One was to expand the serving locations. You heard Dr. Jackson talking about getting things outside of the cafeteria. Expand the eating locations, again, kind of back to what Dr. Jackson was saying about eating in the classroom, also hallways, if you're just sort of moving quickly from one thing to the next. And then we wanted to do kind of a heavy marketing campaign for the school breakfast program. Okay, next slide. So the key strategies also included lots of other things. I think one of the most important things was the development of a school breakfast expansion team. And this team, in terms of engaging students, which I'm going to focus on a lot more in a little bit, but this team, it was highly recommended that it included students, but it also included lots of stakeholders from across the school, from principal to assistant principals to teachers to nurses, of course, food service director and food service staff. But janitors were also encouraged to participate in this team to work through troubleshooting of placement of carts. And then, like I said, students, of course, were encouraged, and in some cases, parents actually participated on this team. So we had the grab-and-go service and menu that was a part of the strategy. We included Second Chance Breakfast actually sort of at the last minute, and I'm going to talk about why we did that. We wanted policies to change so students could eat in the hallway and in classrooms, which was a result of doing the Second Chance Breakfast. And there was always a kickoff, so kind of a point in time when this whole thing was happening. It usually was a little bit after the first day of school in the school year, and we wanted to give a little time in the beginning of the school year to kind of ramp up and do all the things like taste testing and marketing and communication so that everybody was just ready and it started. And it was always a really fun week. There was sort of a breakfast week at each school where they kicked it off. Taste testing was, of course, a big part of developing the menus, and a big part of what I'm going to talk about today is the student-driven marketing. Kind of hearkening back to those youth engagement strategies that Ria talked about. We really did have a model of student-driven development of the marketing campaigns. And then, of course, the principal was heavily involved in communicating these changes across the school because we needed to have a champion and we needed people to kind of get on board with what was happening. And then we had a University of Minnesota Extension group as our kind of on-the-ground, boots on the ground, people supporting the school through these changes. Okay, next slide. So as you can see here, one of the reasons why we had our University of Minnesota Extension partners is that our schools were actually located across the whole state of Minnesota. I'm not going to sort of talk about the design of the study too much because I don't feel like I have time, but I can certainly send resources about what that was all about. But it was a randomized controlled trial, so that meant we were looking at schools that were implementing this and schools that were not, and we were looking at differences between those schools. And schools that did not implement it right away got to implement it 1 year later. So they were just kind of waiting. They didn't have the resources to do it. It's 16 schools, so I just wanted to kind of highlight our breadth of schools. So next slide. And this one is sort of what I was saying. We did a baseline survey with students to understand a lot of things about their lives and their health, but also barriers to eating breakfast. The students who were enrolled in this study, you can see we had 833 students across the state of Minnesota, and those students all reported on a screener that they didn't eat breakfast. They ate breakfast less than 3 days a week. And so we were trying to kind of understand students that were at that spot. So if you want to just click forward, there's a couple of things that are in the slide. But so basically we learned that they weren't hungry in the morning, and that was a huge we had to sort of take a step back and say, okay, having a grab-and-go cart in the morning before school is not going to be the solution. It's only going to solve some problems. So we implemented Second Chance Breakfast. And so you can go ahead and kind of click through the rest of this slide. And then on to the next slide. So yeah, our solution was Second Chance Breakfast, and you heard Dr. Jackson talking all about that, but it was kind of a rapid pace getting things ready and including this in our intervention, and students were a big part of that. So next slide, please. So in terms of engaging students, it kind of went across the whole study. It started with obviously engaging students as participants who we were learning from through our research, but also engaging them in the school breakfast expansion team, which then kind of connected them with food service. And so they did things like led the taste testing. They would sort of come up with the communication strategies in terms of like table tents and fun posters that the school developed on their own. And yeah, I know in a lot of cases the students would actually conduct the taste testing and would do some other fun things like contests where maybe the food service wanted to do kind of a from scratch item, and they would do like a contest for students to submit recipe ideas. So next slide, please. So we worked in terms of our marketing, we wanted to understand if sort of a professional marketing campaign made a big difference in terms of in increasing participation in school breakfast. So we worked with a professional company called Community Blueprint. And next slide. So that group worked with a group of students. We usually worked through student council, marketing classes, drama club, and sort of we would start with a few students, and then they would kind of snowball out and find friends and others who they could engage in this group. And like Dr. Jackson said, we wanted a cross-section of students. So we wanted students who didn't eat breakfast. We wanted students who kind of were maybe not as connected to the school. So we really worked through students to identify the best students to be on this team, the student marketing team. And then the agency met with them 3 to 4 times in about 2 to 3 months. The first few meetings, they decided on the concept. And one really important thing that kind of came out of this process was that across every school that did this, the most important data that the students said needed to be included in this campaign was, where do I get the breakfast? How much does it cost? You know, sort of what's involved, sort of the logistics. So we thought that was interesting. You might have expected it to be a different direction, but they were like, people need to know the logistics. And then, of course, some fun stuff for them to really capture the attention of students across the school. And so that was the idea of those first few meetings. The last few meetings were spent developing the photos and the videos, so the media, and then all of those materials were developed and by the marketing agency and sent back to the school. All right, next slide. So these are just a few examples. We can kind of click through them as I talk here. This is a school where the principal got heavily involved in the marketing group and had a lot of fun. You can see him here. They decided on Hunger Games as their theme, and he's pictured here as Haymitch from that movie. It was very timely. It was at the time when things were really big for Hunger Games. So you can go to the next picture. And that is one of the students who was on the team, and she's pictured as Katniss. And then the next picture is the two of them together. Another important aspect of these pictures is they're holding these breakfast items, kind of a way to show what you might get. And yeah, let's click to the video. So the school developed a video that was played during announcements, and I thought it'd be fun for everyone to watch it. It's about 1.5 minutes, so we'll just go ahead and watch it. I'm not sure if the sound is working.
Should I send the link?
Look, guys, my girl Katniss really dragging at this point. We're going to have to get her some morning fuel. We're going to need to get through the day. So we're going to have to get her a good breakfast.
I'm exhausted. So hungry. Should be breakfast.
What do you say? Breakfast is only $1.35. We give it to her now, we'll have more energy and can focus on conquering her hunger.
right. So we can go back to the presentation then. So, so that just was a fun example that I wanted to make sure to share. Of course, these schools were all working with this professional marketing agency because through the study we had the funds in order to support that kind of thing. And it was a part of our intervention, was to kind of test out this really professionally made marketing materials. But we had schools, like I said, half of the schools didn't do that more professional intervention. They did their intervention a year later and got the same resources, but just didn't have the marketing component in terms of the agency. So these schools we worked with in terms of developing marketing strategies. And what we did was we developed with our marketing agency a whole bunch of posters that are editable. So you could kind of go in as a PDF, you can put all your information, you can pick ones that you think work well, you can work with your class of students and develop a theme that might work, and then kind of use the posters in that theme and put the information in you need. So we kind of had it both ways. We had schools that did it really high class, and then we had schools that just sort of did what they were able to do with the funds that they had. And we really saw success across all those schools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so these are the posters, and I will share, of course, through hopefully I think it's in the slides, but if not, I'll make sure that the organizers share our website, because we've got a whole toolkit that includes these posters and a whole bunch of other resources about what we did with this project. Okay, the next slide. So again, this is an example of one of our schools using their marketing class. So they developed this whole write-up of what was expected of the students, why were they doing this, why were they involved, and what were they going to be doing. And there was sort of a prize that was related to a team that won in terms of the marketing campaign that they developed. So schools really found creative and fun ways to develop these marketing campaigns without the agency. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to just talk really briefly about some of our findings, because I think that's important to highlight too. So as you can see, we saw huge increases in school breakfast participation. We have both in the maroon, the school level change. So this is all students. We got administrative data from the schools for all students. But then we also have in the yellow the breakfast skippers. So these are the students in our cohort who said they didn't eat breakfast. And we saw even bigger increases in participation among those students who said they didn't eat breakfast. So that was pretty huge for us. All right, next slide. So, and then this highlights this increase in social support or encouragement to eat breakfast. We asked a question on the survey: during a usual month, how often do the following people encourage you to eat or continue to eat breakfast at school? And you can see that other kids at my school was one of our significant findings in terms of an increase from the beginning to the end of the study. And that was meaningful because that meant that the students were seeing the other students at the school as a part of the communication and marketing. It wasn't just something driven by the school and by the teachers or by the principal. And then other school staff was an interesting finding, and I think that had to do with more visibility of food service staff. They were out in the hallways with their carts and, you know, encouraging students to come over and grab a breakfast between first and second period. All right, next slide. So this is sort of more complicated than I really have time to describe, but we did an economic analysis of this whole study, and we looked at both our schools with the professional marketing campaign and the schools that did not have that. And all of the schools across the board saw increases. So the schools that did this intervention a year later saw huge increases in breakfast participation, which does translate into economic benefits. So it translated here where I've kind of boxed off this result. It's from a paper that we've published that shows average profits, daily profits of about $159, which then translated into recouping costs of what it was, sort of what was put into developing all of these changes for the breakfast programs. And we think this is important because it does show that you invest up front, but you make it back financially because of the way that you can increase breakfast participation. All right, next slide. So this is the toolkit that we have, and again, I'll make sure this is shared with everyone. It's got all these resources that I've talked about, and even more stuff. All right, next slide. And yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. We appreciate you joining us today to share all of this exciting information out of Minnesota. As Amy shared, we will definitely include all of these resources in follow-up communication after the webinar. We have questions that have come through already. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them through the chat box now. With the time we have left, we will get to as many questions as possible, but do know if you have a question that you want answered, go ahead and put it in because we are happy to follow up by email to get you the answer to your question if we're not able to do it in our time together now. So one of the questions that came in is around ideas or strategies to mitigate the stigma children feel around the school meals program. In the interest of time, I'm going to take that and speak to it fairly briefly. We definitely see in thinking about the school breakfast program, breakfast after the bell being one of the strategies that can reduce the stigma around the school meals program. Breakfast after the bell, in short, is bringing the breakfast to the students as opposed to the students having to go to where the breakfast is. It's making breakfast a part of the school day. So moving it to after that first instructional bell. And by making these changes in terms of location and time, it's making breakfast something that is part of the school day. It's more accessible to more students. So you have, it has been proven to increase participation rates. Also universal breakfast, so offering breakfast at no out-of-pocket cost to all students is something else that can help with that. There are a number of kind of back-end financial mechanisms. There are programs available like the community eligibility provision and provision 2 that can help schools make this a reality. Also, in terms of your promotion and marketing efforts, by really communicating the fact that school meals have a benefit to all students and all families. So while we know that there is a particular value add for students from low-income families, school meals really benefit all kids. And I think to that effect, thinking about, the athletes in your school, thinking about getting coaches on board. We know that, good nutrition is very important to them. So how can they be advocates to really help, again, spread that message across all students? And then Dr. Jackson, it looks like we have a question for you. And the question starts by saying that it looks like your schools are in a rural area. Do you have any point of view on how kids in rural areas engage in programs differently than kids in urban areas?
Thank you very much for the question. And as a rule, kids are kids regardless of rural or urban areas. Poverty is poverty regardless of what that looks like. We are in a very rural area, and I think it kind of goes along with the question that was just answered in terms of making breakfast cool or helping encourage students to get past the pride piece, and that may be I don't know that that's even unique to a rural setting, but certainly in a rural setting, we have a lot of pride. And so admitting that we may not have all the resources that others have doesn't necessarily come easily. But we worked specifically to invite students to help us by participating in the program, by being seen, going to the carts, by having breakfast themselves. And so I don't know that I can add much beyond how rural is different from urban in terms of getting past stigmas and that piece of it. But I do think that inviting student leaders, whether it's the athletes or the students that other students would say they look to participate in breakfast and be seen participating in the Second Chance Breakfast or the Grab and Go, certainly has great benefit, whether we're talking about breakfast or any other program in the school.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time and being respectful of our scheduled end time, we're going to wrap up the question and answer as far as it goes on today's webinar. But again, please, if you have questions that you haven't shared yet, go ahead and put those through the chat box. we'll be able to answer those questions via email. Also, again, as promised, we will send you follow-up information after the webinar so that you have quick access to some of the resources that were shared today. And lastly, we'll also share for those of you who have roles that go beyond school breakfast. My colleagues are offering a webinar next week on leveraging user insights to enhance your summer meals program. And we're going to have one of the No Kid Hungry Youth Ambassadors on that webinar to talk about the summer meals program, which is of course timely as we get into summer. But again, just a big thank you for all of you for joining us today. Final chance to put questions into the chat box. And again, a big thank you to our guest speakers for joining us today and sharing the incredible work that you're doing around engaging students in the success of school breakfast. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.